Good afternoon, Dr. Michael Mina. Thanks a lot for joining today in Radio el Respeto. It's a pleasure to have you. It's been a long time chase, so we are very glad to have you here.
Well, very, very happy to join you.
Dr. Michael Mina is an epidemiologist, immunologue, doctor. He is a professor in the Harvard Chan Public Health School. He's also a doctor in a Brigham and Women's Hospital. I think that's the name. And certainly he's been on top of he's a top of mind guy, I would say. A very prominent opinions and super helpful with lots of different people. I've been watching recently, Doctor, a live show. No, it was not a live show, but that you did with the Slovaks, with some experts from Slovakia. It was super helpful, and we are missing and that sort of expertise over here in Spain.
Yeah, it's one of the central themes, I think, of this pandemic has been dealing with a pandemic like this is normally infectious disease dynamics and understanding the kinetics of viruses and putting all the pieces together, how to test, how to vaccinate. It's usually a pretty niche field, really. And so one of the main themes, I think, of this pandemic globally has been just a void of good information and sort of a mass amount of information all over the place, to the point where people don't really know, I suppose, what to listen to and really where to get the right information. And so at least I try to use my platform to help people understand things a little bit more simply, I suppose.
Has anybody from Spain contacted you to get your expertise at a political level or from a journalist point of view?
Yeah, certainly. I wouldn't be able to recall the names and folks at this point, but certainly over the months I've spoken to quite a number of people in Spain, both scientists, policymakers. Earlier it was really about sort of what should we expect from the epidemic. Mm-hmm. And then it kind of moved into more sort of how can we get PCR-based testing up and working? What can we do with the tests to improve them? And then more recently, it's been a lot of what I talk about is rapid testing and vaccines. And so it's kind of shifted. There's been like a number of different stages of this pandemic, and certainly Spanish government and scientists in Spain have been quite vocal and have reached out quite a bit.
That's great. That's great because, one of the things that we've been told is that there was an expert panel, but it seems that there was not an expert panel afterwards. But we are not here to talk about politics. So I'm glad that actually someone reached at you and that you are giving your point of view. The first question for you would be, have we got the strategy so far all wrong?
I think that depends on if you want to say that we've had a strategy, I suppose.
That's a very good point. Did we? I guess it depends on a country level, but it seems that we didn't have a clear strategy over here. And I think it was very similar in your country, in the US.
Absolutely. Certainly in the US, which is the country I can speak maybe the most towards, we've had no strategy. We've had negative strategy, really. We've had conflicting government agencies that speak directly against each other. And by not having strategy in the first place, we haven't been able to build the skeletons and the framework, if you will, to recognize when our strategy, the little that we have had, if any, has gone off. Mm-hmm. And I think that in general, we kind of plowed into this pandemic assuming that what we saw in South Korea and in China would work in all cultures and all societies. And so we just kind of said, yeah, we know how to deal with the pandemic. It's, surveillance testing with some, infrequent PCR-based testing based on symptomatics, and then contact trace them and try to get people to distance and wear masks. Distancing and wearing masks, at least in the US, has largely failed in a lot of places in the country because of politics. And then contact tracing and surveillance testing has failed as well. Yet we keep trying to just keep pushing these same things without being able to step back and say, what's not working? Why is it not working? What's the root cause analysis here to understand what we could be doing differently and better and where we could make up for lost time? And instead, we just keep beating our head against the same wall and hoping that our headache is going to go away. And this hasn't really been effective at all. And we're seeing hundreds of thousands of people die in our country, millions across the globe, and cases completely out of control. Yet we have remained unwilling in much of the world to change course, to change strategy, to admit that maybe our normal traditional public health tools are not working in the context that we were hoping they would. And we have to think of new solutions. But we've just seen resistance after resistance and apathy, lack of urgency, and just complete disarray, I would say, in terms of a response.
I was watching a recent video that you did. I don't recall the group. And I found extremely interesting that you were talking about seasonality. And let me explain you why I'm asking this question. In the first place, around April, there were a lot of questions whether we will face softer heat during the summer. And there were questions like, well, maybe the heat will help. Then, at least in our country, in Spain, but also in Europe, we went through a very strict lockdown. So we basically, from March to June, we were under strict lockdown. Then we reopened extremely fast, and we had a relatively quiet summer. So it was all very quiet, and our politicians, they were not preparing. And we saw that because after September, the curve started to grow again, and we faced not the same problems, but very similar at a lower scale. Now it seems we went through partial lockdowns, and it seems that we are flattening the curve again, and the incident goes down. And very rapidly, politicians are saying, this message works. But in your view, as far as I know, the lockdowns are not the response to this pandemic. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think there's a few pieces there. So certainly, I think it's important to point out just how much we knew about this virus going into it. And so you're right, I talk a lot about seasonality, and I was talking about this back in March and April. In the US, when we started to go into lockdowns, I remember getting interviewed and saying, we absolutely have to start thinking about the fall, because by the time we come out of lockdown, the summer would be upon us and probably be helping to drive transmission downwards. And that would give us a false sense of security that we figured out how to beat the virus. And then when the fall comes around, we're going to see these massive explosions. And, I sent you over some slides. If you go to the third slide, or I think it's the slide number 3, I always like to show this slide because I just want people to recognize, yes, this one, how predictable practically everything of this virus has been. There have been more or less no surprises with this virus. Yet we continue to be surprised by it. And this, what I'm showing here, is 2010 to 2020. These are seasonal coronaviruses. And we know, what you could see is every fall and winter, they spike really high, and then they come back down, and then they spike really high, and then they come back down. And this is consistent across all of the seasonal coronaviruses. And we know that this coronavirus was very, very, very likely to act just like its closest neighbors. And so the fact that we, in the US and much of the world, did not prepare for what we're undergoing now, which is another surge, a massive surge. And we thought that we were able to really kind of pat ourselves on the back during the summer and say, we got this under control. That was just seasonality really working on our side. And I think that a central theme of this pandemic has been this consistent unwillingness to recognize how much we know about a virus like this already, that it's really acting so much like a textbook virus. And I've tweeted about this, and I've written some articles about just how much this virus is acting as expected, even though it's novel.
But I'm extremely surprised to hear that comment, because the narrative over here on the TV and on the radio is like, we don't know much, we're learning, we don't know much about the virus, and everybody at a political level, they seem to, to put themselves medals very quickly as soon as the curve starts to flatten. So now we see that again. Our incidence was almost 500 cases per 100,000 people a few weeks ago. Now, today, our incidence is 275. And they are already, what we are doing works. But if I look at this slide, I can sense that we still have a long winter to go through.
Absolutely. We absolutely do. And, my hope is that we'll start to get seasonality back on our side again, in a couple of months. But we do have a long winter still. It is very peaky. So the moment it is kind of done, epidemics are either growing exponentially or they're falling exponentially, unless you just happen to hit like right on R equals 1 and you have a sort of a plateau. But usually they're either going up fast or they're going down fast. And so that's a good thing, and you can kind of see that borne out in these really spiky looking graphs. Sure. But absolutely, we have a long time to go, and it's disheartening to hear you say that so many people, that the narrative. I agree with the narrative everywhere is that we don't know anything about it. We're just learning about this virus. But if we could lean on what we already know, and all the virology and all the immunology and all the epidemiology that we've done for decades to build us up to this point, so that when we really need all of this information, we could use it, we would be in a better position. I worry that you asked about lockdowns. I don't think lockdowns are the solution. Lockdowns should be the last resort, in my opinion. They are exceedingly expensive. They are demoralizing. They cause depression. There's so many problems with lockdowns. Sometimes they're necessary, for sure. But we should be doing everything in our power to avoid lockdowns. And we have so many tools, if we choose to use them, to avoid those lockdowns. In large part, we have not, in many countries anyway, utilized those tools. And when we have used lockdowns as a tool, we haven't done it. We have sort of we've squandered the time during those lockdowns. We locked down in March, April, May here, and we did nothing to prepare ourselves to come out of the lockdown in a better position. And so we found ourselves, the moment the fall hit, we are now in a terrible position asking for lockdowns again. And it's been very difficult to see us not utilize science on our side, and we have so many options and so many opportunities to tackle this in a more coherent, strategic way that we haven't really, unfortunately, utilized.
So, Michael, you've been extremely vocal about what should be the plan, and you have one tweet fixed on your profile in Twitter and says, "No lockdowns, no waiting for vaccines, reverses cases in weeks." So what is this strategy in your view that we should be following or pursuing at this point?
Yeah, so one of the most powerful tools we have during a pandemic like this is knowledge of status. If people know that they are infectious, they can act and stop themselves from infecting other people around them, their loved ones, their friends, their work colleagues, whomever it might be. But in a case like this, knowing your status, knowing if you're in a transmissible state, requires a test. It just does. And that's because most people are transmitting even before they become symptomatic.
Sure.
And a lot of people never become symptomatic at all, but yet are still at risk of transmitting to their loved ones and friends.
Yeah, we've seen that announcement, or that new article, or I don't know how do you call it, from CDC, saying that's up to 60% of transmission happens pre-symptomatic, asymptomatic. So it is huge.
It is. It absolutely is. And that should have been announced more officially months ago. We've known this. This isn't surprising. We just haven't had the urgency to really take bold steps and announce things like that. But what that demands, or what that means, is that the demands on testing have increased, but a different type of testing. So far in this pandemic, we have really focused on PCR-based testing, and I think it's important when we're dealing with a pandemic like this to recognize that there's different uses for different tests. Mm-hmm. And so we've focused a lot on medical-based testing. This is the type of testing that's for symptomatic people going to the doctor. PCR testing is a good approach there. But then we have, there you go. And so this is a slide I made. And so we have medical diagnostic testing. But then that's just one type of test. We have surveillance testing, which some people across the world have used. And this is like you go to a drive-through, you get contact traced if you're positive. It's not intended to test everyone. It's intended more to give public health officials information on what's happening in the community and to hopefully contact trace as many people as possible. But for an epidemic like this, you can't get enough people through those PCR tests frequently enough to really make that much of a dent. Mm-hmm. And then we have two different types of tests. They're both screening tests. And these, I think, are the most powerful tools for an epidemic like this. One is called entrance screening, and that's how it sounds, which is the type of screening if you want to walk into a restaurant, or you want to walk into a movie theater, or a nursing home, or a school. Maybe you need to be screened and show that you're not positive in order to gain entry. And so these types of tests are one way to reduce spread. But then there's an even more powerful type of testing, which we have completely not utilized yet. And this is what I call public health screening, or outbreak suppression screening. This is almost to step in for vaccines while we're waiting for vaccines. If you test enough people frequently enough, say you have half of the whole population testing themselves twice a day, testing themselves twice a week, so maybe Monday and Friday, for example, you can actually stop enough spread with a virus like this so that the epidemic comes crashing down. You get this value called R. It's the effective reproductive number of the virus. And if R is above 1, then that means for every 100 people that get infected, they go on and infect, say R is 1.3. 100 people would infect 130 people. Sure. But let's say R is below 1. It doesn't need to be perfect. You don't have to go to 100% to 0. But if you have 100 people infect 80 people, that's an R of 0.8. Mm-hmm. And if those 80 people then go on and infect 65 people, and 65 people go on and infect 50 people, all of a sudden the epidemic stops spreading very quickly. Sure. And so the way that we can get that R value below 1 is to give enough people information on their infectious status so that they can make informed decisions about how best to not go and infect their loved ones. Maybe they don't go to dinner. Maybe they try not to go to work if they can afford it. Maybe they don't go to the movie, or whatever it might be. They don't go shopping. They take personal mitigation strategies to stop themselves from spreading to other people. Mm-hmm. And the only way to get enough people to know their status, though, is to get testing out to the masses. And PCR testing won't do that.
I want to interrupt you for a second, and I apologize for that. But I think it's important that you are highlighting infectious people. One thing is to be infected, and one thing is to be infectious. Mm-hmm. And I think that the movie we've watched so far, the way that has been told to us, it is not like that. So we do not understand that there is a window where you are infectious to others, and that window actually is pretty short.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. The window when people are actually infectious is probably, a matter of days. And this is probably actually, I'll show on the next, after we go through this slide, I'll show why it's really an even shorter amount of time than this. What I have showing here is an example of what somebody's viral trajectory might look like inside of their body.
Yep.
And when somebody gets infected with this or exposed, they get infected, the virus takes a few days to grow. And then once it starts growing quickly, it turns PCR positive. And then it's shooting upwards. The virus goes really, really high.
Really
it
fast.
grows from 10 viral particles to a billion or a trillion viral particles over a day or two. And then the virus comes crashing down again because the body can't withstand having a ton of virus in it. If you have 1 trillion viral particles per milliliter, and that virus grows just a couple more replication cycles, it would kill you. It would eat through all of your cells. Sure. You'd end up in the hospital. So your body has to kind of contain it really fast. And then people will stay PCR positive. So the virus dies. The live virus goes away after a few days. And then people will actually stay PCR positive for a really long time.
Yep.
Maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks or more. And that's kind of like a crime scene. Where if a crime has been committed, in the wake of the crime, you end up having maybe some DNA will last at the crime scene for weeks or months or years even. And so somebody can go in and use PCR to actually detect the DNA from that crime scene well after the crime has been committed. In public health, for medicine, you might be acting more like a detective, where you want to reconstruct somebody's whole infectious history. You want to know, was my patient infected, or are there symptoms due to COVID? But if you're in public health and you're trying to stop outbreaks, you're really interested in the question, is this individual infectious and a danger to other people today? Not were they infectious a week or two ago? And so the difference there is exceedingly important because it demands a different test. If you want to know if somebody's infectious, then you want a test that only turns positive when somebody's infectious and not on the other sides of that spectrum. And so that's actually, there's little paper strip tests. The really rapid paper strip tests can detect people when they are infectious. They're truly made out of paper with some other ingredients on them essentially. And they can be done in 5 minutes, 2 minutes of hands-on time. You have a result. It shows up like a line, just like a pregnancy test. So if somebody swabs the front of their nose on their own, they put the swab onto the test, drop a few drops of buffer onto it, and a line will show up.
So if you're positive, very easy to use.
So they're exceedingly easy to use. I was just visiting family. We all use them. They are 99 to 100% sensitive to detect people when they are most infectious. They are very, very specific. Sure. So they're false positive, 1 every few hundred, but there's ways to really make that into 1 every few thousand. So they're very, very specific. And they do a very good job at finding people when they are most infectious.
So the red rectangle here. This is when you are really infectious, and what you're saying is that this type of testing, this type of antigen tests on paper strips, easy to use, they could catch you when it matters, which is the red rectangle. While a PCR might, by the time you get the results, because the system is completely jammed, by the time you get the results, you are in this gray area on the right, so you are not infectious anymore, so it doesn't matter.
That's exactly right, and it's even worse than that because there's two delays in getting a PCR test. One is getting to the doctor or to the testing site, and people don't usually do that until they already have symptoms. So most people don't go get tested unless they have symptoms already. So already we know that by the time somebody develops their symptoms, they're well into the infectious period already. So then you wait another couple of days before you go get that PCR test. Now you're already, by the time you get the swab taken, you're already nearing the end of that red zone.
Yeah.
And then by the time you get the results, you're way beyond it. You
You're way
might be
beyond.
well into that gold zone where the PCR might still tell you that you're positive, but your infectious period is over. And then to compound the problems, then you're done infecting, and then people tell you to isolate for 10 days when you don't even need to anymore because you've been finished infecting other people already. So it's the worst of all worlds. And these rapid antigen tests could actually be delivered to people's homes. They could be, like I picture, you brush your teeth in the morning and you take a COVID test.
Sure.
They're that simple and could really allow people to know. You just do that regularly, routinely as part of your daily routine, and you'd be able to find out that you're positive even if you have no symptoms.
Do you have the impression that there is sort of a pushback from doctors who have been all life testing with the gold standard, which is the PCR, and they say, this is super precise? And it's also true that the first antigen tests, probably they were not the best, and there were some that failed miserably, and now there is sort of a urban myth that they are not sensitive enough or not specific enough. But I've read several studies now that they confirm that at least some of them are pretty good. And when I say pretty good, they are super sensitive. We are talking about 98% sensitivity in comparison with the PCRs. But the truth to be told is that I feel like a strong pushback from those physicians saying, no, this is not going to work. Why do you think is that?
Well, the reason is, if you go back to that slide, actually, I can explain it here. The reason these tests got a bad rap is because when they started being used, it wasn't until, people were assuming that anytime you're PCR positive, you have infectious virus. Mm-hmm. And back in August, I believe, I was trying to explain loudly that PCR did not equate to infectivity. And so I went to the New York Times and I said, this needs to be a story that's written.
That story became global, and it has created a huge wave of, we got it all wrong. People with 40 cycles, they were locked down, and I remember that article.
Yeah, the article got a lot of attention. It had some issues in that it led to maybe more confusion, but at least it got people thinking about CT values. And it got people talking about this idea that, hey, it's not the whole time that you're PCR positive that you are infectious. But what people were doing up until really recently is that they were going out and they were asking people, how good is the antigen test relative to the PCR test? Mm-hmm. And what they were finding was that they kept measuring PCR positivity and not finding antigen test positivity. But what I've been trying to push with our research, and now I think it's finally starting to become more commonly discussed, is that, hey, most of the time somebody is PCR positive, they don't even have antigen or live virus in them. And so that's why we were comparing the antigen tests inappropriately to PCR. And so the compromise that we've kind of come to as a globe now is to say, well, what are the thresholds of PCR that do represent infectious virus? And so maybe a CT value below 30, which means you're starting to get into higher viral loads. Really, it's below 25 and 24, you get into much higher viral loads. But what we found is when we stratify the results and we say, okay, how sensitive are these antigen tests to detect somebody who has a CT value below 30? Then boom, they went from 30% sensitive or 40% sensitive to 98, 99% sensitive. Mm-hmm. And I think that it took really pushing this idea, which has been a very uphill battle, to get physicians and laboratory directors to understand that PCR positivity does not mean infectious. It's still a battle that's being fought.
The other battle about, one is sensitivity and specificity, or I don't know how to pronounce it anymore, but you know what I mean. But the other big battle was, should we use this in low incidence places, and should we use these type of tests with asymptomatic people? Because we have had in our show prominent doctors saying, and that was a few weeks ago, and I know now they've changed the view about this, and they say, now I get it. This doctor I talked to you about, Dr. Camacho, has been here a few weeks ago or months now saying, in low incident places or in asymptomatic people, we should not be using antigens. Also, with some bad experiences of people who were positive PCR with 15 cycles, so totally infective, and they were negative on the antigen test. But after lots of, comparisons, he says, I think the limit is in 25 cycles, more or less, from what he has tested himself. But I think he's changed his view a bit on asymptomatics and low incidence places. What's your view on that?
Yeah, so asymptomatics, I think these tests just simply don't care about symptoms. The tests only care about the virus. Mm-hmm. So if somebody has enough virus to transmit, regardless of their symptoms, they will turn positive. Okay. The interesting thing is, it could be argued that an asymptomatic person might even require a higher viral load to transmit because they're not coughing the virus all over the place and things like that. So for asymptomatics, they work just as well. The confusion has been, of course, because it's difficult to know where an asymptomatic is in their viral cycle. Sure. And so there was nothing to really ground the evaluation from. If it's symptomatics, you can say, well, how good are these antigen tests within 7 days or 5 days of symptom onset? In an asymptomatic, you're only asking how good is this against PCR positivity. And so until we really started to say how good is it at different thresholds of PCR positivity, it was leading to a lot of erroneous claims. And in fact, we expect that if you just go out into the street and you test 1,000 people with a PCR test and you find 100 of them PCR positive but asymptomatic, you'd actually expect that 70 out of those 100 people would be negative on a rapid test. Mm-hmm. And that's not because the rapid test is missing them. It's because those 70 people out of the 100 who are PCR positive just simply don't have live virus left. It's just the remnant RNA. But that led to just so much confusion with people saying, oh, they're not accurate in asymptomatics. But we know that they work just as well in asymptomatics as symptomatics.
Do you think that it is important to repeat those antigen tests frequently? I guess so, because of what you're saying, that we need cheap things that you can use at home, that they are easy to use, affordable, and that you mentioned already, like 2 times a week should be the target. What's your view on that? And the reason I'm asking this is because now, and you've faced, I guess, something similar recently with Thanksgiving in the US, but here in Spain, Christmas is a big thing. We have these dates approaching, and the talk on the street is, I will get antigen test done, I will pay for it, or a PCR, and if I'm negative, that's done. But that's quite dangerous, right? Because if they don't catch you in the window, that will be difficult.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. We need the testing to be frequent. There's no, you can have the best test in the world, but if you never use it, it won't catch anyone. And it's just all a gradient of that. So if you have really good tests, but you're only using them once every, say, 3 or 4 weeks, you're just not going to catch people. And most people in the current testing regimens that we have now, they are generally going and getting tested, say, once every few months max. Sure. Most people don't get tested frequently. And the only way to catch people, we can really boost the sensitivity of these tests to catch people if we test frequently. And so one of the big philosophical changes that we need to kind of make is to stop thinking about the individual test sensitivity given the test that's in front of you, and think about the test regimen effectiveness to catch infectious people. And the only way to really do that is to use a kind of test that you can do frequently. And so you just have people, using these tests on a regular basis, these types of paper strip tests that can be that, you brush your teeth and you use a test. and maybe 3 days later you brush your teeth and you use a test. And it's that type of pretty frequent use that you'll be likely to find yourself early in your infection so that you can pull yourself out of the community. And we find, for example, that if just half of a community was doing that twice a week, and the other half was completely disregarding their tests or just not using them at all, and you had 10% of the tests that were being used failed miserably, just were wrong, you'd still, just that amount of testing, so ultimately 40% getting good results, would actually cause an outbreak from exponentially increasing to drop down very, very rapidly. You'd immediately start seeing the gains. Within a week, you'd see the epidemic turnover, and within a few more weeks, you'd end up seeing cases really drop dramatically.
We should be pushing to get those cheap, affordable, at home, ready for everybody tests. So we'll be pushing for that. Last question: if someone wants to have a safe Christmas, what would be your recommendation? Like, hey, what should I do? Something really quickly, because I know you need to leave.
Well, there's a couple of things. I think if you are dead set on seeing your family for Christmas, and you definitely want to do that, the best thing you can do right now, given the tools that are available for the most part, is try to quarantine as much as you can. If you can work from home, do that for a week and a half or 2 weeks before Christmas.
Great.
And ask everyone else who you're getting together with to do that. If you can get access to, if you can have your Christmas outdoors, do that. If you can get access to these rapid tests, they can be extremely powerful tools to, if everyone were to test, for example, right before they get together for a meal. Don't use it as the excuse to get together for the meal, but if you're getting together for the meal, have everyone use a rapid test right beforehand. And that would really cut the odds dramatically of anyone being...
Just one test, or should repeat it in 3 days?
Well, I mean, if you're having a meal, use it 15 minutes before you actually get together. So use it right beforehand. And that would be that's kind of the entrance screening idea, where you can just make, but also recognize that negative test is only really... it's only really valid for maybe that day or half a day. Afterwards, you start to run into the risk of being positive. Maybe you got infected yesterday and you turn positive the next day, and so on.
Dr. Michael Mina, it's been great speaking to you. It's been an honor, and I hope we can have extra time some other day. I know you're super busy, but I guess people will be super glad to watch this video. So hopefully one day we will repeat this interview. Thank you so much.
Happy to come back anytime. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Take care.